Founder and CTO of Dacient, which provides web anti-malware technology for online businesses. And today we have a really great talk on malvertising and mobile malware madness. So without further ado, let's welcome McNeil.
Great, thank you very much, David. So I think that the last time that I gave a talk here at Google was a good 2 years ago or so. And in that 2 years, I've seen Google launch an amazing number of great services, recently in the social networking space as well. I've also been absolutely thrilled to see Google pay a lot of attention to online security, online privacy. I've seen search encrypted in beta. That's been great to see. I've also seen a whole variety of things get launched with regards to keeping privacy online as well. So I've been glad to see the continued focus on safe browsing, increased focus on Android security, continued focus on click fraud and areas like that. And so it just warms my heart to see Google continue to do a lot of great work in that area. When I had come here about 2 years ago, Dacient as a company had just closed its seed round funding. We were just a few employees, and we had just launched our beta web anti-malware service, which helps businesses monitor their online presence for web malware threats. Since then, we've not only taken that service GA, but we have launched an anti-malvertising service. We are working with many large ad networks to help keep their online advertising ecosystem safe. We have also been doing a lot more work in the area of mobile as well. And so, in addition, I think one of the things I wanted to mention is that it's just great to return to the mothership. Since this past February, we formally announced that Google Ventures led our Series A round of financing, and I've had the pleasure of working with great folks at Google Ventures like Kareem Ferris and Four, and having additional interactions with folks like Vint Cerf from time to time, and I look forward to continuing to help create a online safe ecosystem for advertising across both traditional web and mobile environments. And so in my talk today, I'm going to talk about malvertising. I'm going to talk about mobile applications from a malware angle, from a privacy angle, from a performance angle, and I'm going to be happy to take questions that come up during the talk, especially if there's quick clarifications. I'll also be here for a few minutes afterwards to take questions offline. If you have any Google-specific questions, I would also encourage you to ask those after in the offline section. But without further ado, I'll just kind of get underway. In the midst of my talk, I may refer to a lot of resources. All those resources are up on the Dacient website and or my personal website at neildeswine.com. The work that I'll be talking about today is joint work with a number of members from our security team at Dacient, including Tufan Demir, Jerry Eisenhower, and Mike Gagnon, and look forward to telling you more about it. So let me start by talking about malvertising. My guess is that many of you here at Google know and have heard of malvertising, but for all of the folks out there in YouTube land, malvertising is malicious advertising. Basically, you can have cases where you go to a publisher, a very safe, legitimate publisher site on the internet. There will be ads, display ads, and other types of ads that get shown on the page. Those ads, just when they're loaded, may end up doing bad things to users, like issuing a drive-by download or like issuing a fake AV. That's some of the things that most malicious ads do today, but the first malvertisements were actually found back in 2007. The first public reference that I've been able to find on the internet about them goes back to a gentleman by the name of William Saluski, who I think used to work at AOL, may still be working for AOL, and he has an interesting ISC diary entry up here. So the first malvertisements that he saw were actually flash ads that would render in a user's browser, and they would make various action script calls to malicious domains using get URL functions and other functions inside of ActionScript. Since then we have seen a shift. So when a lot of people I speak with first hear the term malvertising, they think, oh, it must be a flash ad. Well, that's not the case. Ads of many different kinds can be used to spread malvertising, and of course, since 2007, there's also been a lot of maturity and a lot of defenses that have been put in place. I'll be talking about some of those. Malicious ads today result in drive-by downloads, result in fake AV. In the case of a drive-by download, when a user loads a page, there may be new processes that start up on the user's machine without them knowing. Malware files can get sent down by taking advantage of browser and or vulnerabilities in third-party plugins, and it happens very silently. But if you look at fake antivirus types of attacks, they are much more visually noticeable in the sense that it'll pop up a dialog box, and I'll show an example of that. But it's affected many publishers, many ad networks, and I'll chat about some of the types of defenses that have been put in place. I'll also talk about some of the trends that have occurred over time, as well as both the bad as well as the good. So if you ever visit a website and that website has ads on it and you see a dialog box like this one pop up where it looks like the Windows Explorer, it tells the user that there's all kinds of Trojans and whatnot on their computer, the thing you should keep in mind is that you may not necessarily want to trust this because the computer probably isn't infected, even though the attacker here is trying to get the user to think that the computer is infected and get them to click something to do a download. So this is an example of a prototypical fake antivirus pop-up. How do these kinds of malvertising attacks happen? I'll briefly review that. There's actually many different ways. I'm going to talk about just one or two. In one model, and I've put up a UML-like sequence diagram here where there's a couple of actors. There's the malvertisers, there's the malvertiser server, there's the ad network, there's the publisher, there's the user. So what the malvertiser or malicious advertiser does is uploads first a legitimate ad onto some server that they own. They create a new account with an ad network. The ad network may look at the ad and see that the ad is good and approve the account. And that ad may then start getting served on publisher sites. Users may access that ad and things are A-OK initially, and the attacker may have created this account with the ad network on, say, Wednesday. But then by the time that Friday comes around, the attacker will replace the legitimate ad with a malicious ad on their server, and because of the fact that many ad networks don't actually host the content, the advertiser has the ability to change that content at any time. So once the attacker uploads the malicious ad, that ad then starts getting served on publisher sites in place of the good ad. And so users can get infected. Some users may complain to the publishers. Some of the publishers may complain to the ad networks. And it sometimes takes a while to get these things locked down. In fact, one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later is the average lifetime of a malvertisement and how that lifetime has changed. But this is one way that malvertising can happen. One of the things that makes malvertising hard to track down, in addition to the attackers launching these things on Friday nights when corporate IT teams are slower to respond over the weekend, is the fact that a lot of ad networks and ad exchanges syndicate their inventory to other ad networks. So you can have a case where a malvertiser uploads a malicious ad to their own server, they create a new account on some ad network B, and ad network A has a relationship with ad network B where some of the time, if, say, ad network B has a more profitable ad for flowers or some other topic, ad network A may decide to redirect requests from publisher sites to ad network B to serve that more profitable ad. Now, of course, what can occur is that even if ad network A has good defenses in place for checking ads for malvertisements and whatnot, ad network B, whom they have a partnership with, ad network B may not have as good defenses. So as a result, these issues can occur. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that ad network A can do. There's a lot of things that ad network B can do. We'll talk about some of those. One additional case that I'll mention is that sometimes you also have malvertisers that pose as an ad network themselves. I'll show an example of that later on. But this is the basic idea, and the reason this makes malvertising hard to catch is because when there is a issue, someone can go to ad network A and say, hey, I think I saw a malvertisement come from you, but they're like, well, it wasn't us, it was somebody else, because they not only have relationships with ad network B, but ad network C, ad network D, etc. And on top of that, ad network B may be sub-syndicating the ad inventory space to somebody else. So that's kind of a quick review of malvertising and why it's hard to catch. Now, there's a number of things that can be done to help lock down these issues. So when we detect malvertisements at Dacient, we have relationships in place with a number of the large ad networks in the space, as well as medium-sized ad networks. And when they work together with us, they give us access to their ad inventory. And when our systems find a malicious ad on the network, they will either send alerts via email or send alerts via some more automated mechanism. This is an example of an alert. And what you see is that there is a URL that we scanned at which their ad tags resided. We identify what is the time at which the malvertisement was caught. And because of the fact that you have to trace down exactly where the malicious ad came from, we provide not only the alert and some forensics around what was caught there, but we provide a full trace of the URLs so that the full syndication and or sub-syndication chain can be identified, so you know exactly where to go and which ad network, sub-syndicated ad network to go to get the malicious ad off of that network. So over here you'll see that there's a trace, and that trace continues onto this next screen. But basically at the end of this trace of URLs that was loaded by a browser when the malvertisement got rendered is a malicious domain. In this case, it has a .in extension, and it served the drive-by download payload. In this particular case, it gets identified, and so that's all there in the syndication chain. One thing that I want to mention is that because of the fact that these things can be hard to identify, hard to pin down, and because there's many players in the space, forensics are really important, and we want to avoid games of he said, she said. And so whenever we at Dacient provide such alerts, in addition to providing the syndication chain, we also provide lots of forensics about what happened when that malvertisement got served. So in this particular case, there was a drive-by download that occurred. There's unauthorized processes that get started. Basically, the malvertisement fingerprinted the user's browser, third-party plugins, determined which client-side pieces of software, say, may be vulnerable to a buffer overflow, and send down the appropriate shellcode in real time to cause new processes to start. So we provide information about what were the new processes that started. A lot of times attackers do fun things like name them things like Adobe Update, so that even if a user did happen to be having a process list up, it may not look suspicious to them, but of course it's not really the Adobe Update process. So in any case, new processes start. We've also seen malvertisements make changes to the user's client machines. For instance, they might change the user's registry. Their registry entries can be changed to disable their personal firewall, which is what's happening in this particular case, so that their machine can be less well defended against other future attacks. But in any case, all these forensics are provided in addition to information about the full HTTP trace and network layer forensics and all the files that were downloaded, whatnot, in this forensic zip file. But I think that forensics are really important because of the fact that when an ad network has to take an ad tag or an ad off of their network, it has financial and business implications for them. So they may not earn a particular revenue stream. They may have to flag a particular partner. And so it's important that the proof be there so that they can make an appropriate decision. So in any case, that's a little bit about forensics. So the old adage of trust but verify is absolutely right and absolutely true. We've also noticed that attackers will do things like only serve certain attacks to certain IPs or certain you serve them only once. And so the forensics are important because you need to see what was actually observed. And when users view malvertisements, sometimes at best we've seen a user send in a screenshot of something, but they don't really know what happened, and it's really hard to track down. So when we do our anti-malvertising monitoring of ad networks, we take all of these things into account. We've done things like deploy a worldwide distributed proxy network to scan from, so that our IPs are constantly rotating, etc. So in any case, that's a little bit about what happens when malvertisements are found. I'm going to now talk about a couple trends in the area of malvertising. The first trend that I'll mention and talk a little bit about is something that I alluded to earlier. When the first malvertisements were identified back in 2007, they were flash ads. But since then, we've actually seen that most malvertisements have not been flash ads. What we have done is a survey of all the different exploit kits that we see when malvertising and web malware attacks occur, and looked at which vulnerabilities those exploit kits used. So over here, we found that the top vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the attacker's exploit kits actually target ActiveX, Adobe Reader, and Java Virtual Machines. And we have a graph here of how prevalent and we've listed the different exploits by their MITRE common vulnerability enumeration number. You see the different popularities for the different exploits. But it's really important for us to have a solid understanding of this if we're indeed going to be able to produce solid defenses. One of the other things that we've done at Dacient is, in addition to scanning our ad network customers and our media and our banking customers, we also run a set of telemetry which just monitors millions of sites online, where we see not only the current attacks, but see a whole bunch of gray area cases. And we use that intelligence that comes from that to constantly identify what are all the new exploits that are being used. And as you can imagine, within our own scanning infrastructure, we make the appropriate adjustments to track the current threats and just keep up with this on a regular basis. So that's the first trend. The first malvertisements were flashed, but now they're pretty much drive-bys and fake antivirus. A second trend is that when the display advertising game started way back in the late 90s, most advertisers would go directly to a website and say, I would like to advertise on your website. Or they would go to a ad network like a DoubleClick or NetGravity, which had existed at that time, and have a direct relationship then with the ad network. But since then, over the past dozen plus years, there have been more and more intermediaries that have been introduced over time. So there's a lot more parties in between the advertiser and the publisher. And in addition to traditional ad networks, there's also ad exchanges, there's DSPs, there's agencies, media buying platforms. And so the syndication chains that we've seen occurring with all this activity taking place have just been increased. Very often before an ad is shown, there might be anywhere between 5 and 20 redirects between all the different intermediaries before a given ad is shown. So that's why syndication chains and forensics are really important when you're looking at these kinds of issues. I should also mention that malvertisers can attempt to introduce themselves at any point in the chain, if they can compromise any party in between. So we have seen more intermediaries over time. One of the things that I should mention with regards to these syndication chains is that as they become more complicated, I think we as an industry are going to have to continue to think more carefully about how to mitigate things. On this graph, I have just a very high level representation. You may have a top tier ad network like Ad Network A, and they may be running an ad exchange. There may be a number of different other ad networks that we're interacting with, B, C, and D. B, C, and D, of course, may have relationships of their own with other ad networks and so on. And kind of at the very leaf level of this syndication tree is all of the advertising creatives. So from a security standpoint, if you thought about, okay, how should we make sure that online advertising is safe and secure, one might hope and expect that, well, every ad that's kind of at the leaf here should be scanned and or regularly monitored to make sure that it is safe. Now, of course, as things have morphed over time, that has been hard to enforce simply because advertisers, ad networks, they want a lot of flexibility, and so one model that can play out, though, is we have seen top-level ad networks and medium-sized ad networks deploy more and more anti-malvertising defenses because they're the bigger brands that kind of have the most accountability. And we've started to see them doing scanning, but when they find something, when you find something, then it typically means that there's some intermediaries that are closer to the advertising creatives that perhaps are not doing as much to defend against malicious ads being introduced into the ecosystem. So we've seen a couple models, and let me chat a little bit about some of these models, and then I may return to this diagram. But how do we drive this ecosystem forward? How do we achieve more security on the online advertising ecosystem? And I should mention that the top players have been doing a lot. But I think there's a couple key considerations. One key consideration is defense in depth. If we look at many of the top players, they very well understand that there is, just as in the PC-based antivirus industry, it's unlikely that there's going to be any one antivirus product that's going to detect any and all malware. And that's pretty well understood. One of the things in the PC world is that because of the fact that a lot of antivirus packages hook into the kernel level, you typically can only run one on your PC, and that introduces issues with regards to detection. But one of the things that's true in the online ad world that is not true in the PC world is that because most of these ads are being served from servers on the cloud, there isn't any reason that we can't have multiple anti-malware and multiple anti-malvertising services deployed in order to look for malicious ads. And that allows us to have defense in depth. We don't have to rely on any one technology. So for instance, even with many of the large ad networks having some internal systems in place, we've seen that the largest players realize that there isn't going to be one system that's going to catch everything, and so they have frameworks in place where they work with multiple parties like ourselves to scan sub-syndicated and syndicated ad networks. So I think that's one good positive step that I'm seeing in the industry. Defense in depth, multiple technologies can be used. Now, in addition to the benefit of better detection by using multiple services, there's also another consideration, a business consideration. Even if there was one perfect technology that could be used to scan for malicious ads in a network, the question is how much is it going to cost and who should bear that cost? If we look at this previous diagram, if ad network A, large ad network A, has to expend lots of dollars to scan not only B, C, and D's ads, but E, F, G, etc., all the way down, it's going to cost them a lot. And they are helping all of these folks down the chain make money. So to an extent, if we want to move to a world where there's more and more defenses at the leaves, right, closer to the ad creatives, one could imagine a scenario where ad network A tells ad networks B, C, and D, hey, look, if you're going to participate as part of my exchange, you should come to us with a clean ad tag inventory, and you should perhaps do some scanning of your own. And one model is that they ask them to do that even before they come to ad network A. Now, of course, the issue is that it might be hard to do that on day one. Certainly, I've seen cases where when ad network A finds that ad network B redirected to somebody that served a malicious advertisement, ad network A tells ad network B, hey, look, you guys better do something. You better have some malware protections in place because I don't want you messing up my ad network. So we have seen cases like that. And I think that there will be more and more of that going forward. So in any case, one of the things that does is it allows ad network A to not have to take on all of the cost when they're in fact helping other ad networks down the chain, generate revenue. So that's another positive reason, another positive trend that I've been seeing. with regards to more anti-malvertising monitoring getting pushed down into the intermediaries on the network. My hope is that one day we'll be at a point where all of the leaves will be effectively monitoring their ad inventory. With regards to incentives and enforcement, I mentioned that I've seen cases where one ad network banned another ad network from participating in their exchange. I've seen other models where offending ad networks have been given a warning and said, hey, look, you have X many days or weeks to make sure that your ad inventory, your ad tags are being served cleanly. In terms of other options, they can require them to do their own scanning, or they could require them to use one of a number of recommended parties in order to have that scanning done, who they vetted. So in any case, there's a number of different options here. With regards to the security issue of authorization, very often in the security world, there's this concept of deny by default, right? You should not let anything onto your network unless you know it's secure. Of course, due to various business considerations, we've seen allow by default get used in the online advertising world. Usually, an ad network will accept almost any partner after doing some kind of vetting, but perhaps not as deeply as could be done. And they pretty much allow anybody onto their networks, and then they monitor and they see if there might be any malvertisements being served before they kind of take them out of the loop. But in a deny by default setting, one might say an ad network A might tell ad network B, look, I'm not going to accept you as a partner unless you can show me that you are keeping an eye on your network for malvertisements. So these are just some considerations to think about with regards to moving the ecosystem forward. And I'd look at the talk today here as part of a continued dialogue with Google as well as the other ad networks. So in any case, let me move on to the next trend. The next trend is the trend of zero-day malware. We've seen that attackers know that they are dealing with the fact that a good percentage of their user base might have antivirus engines, and so what they do is they will, when they come up with new malware, when they come up with new variants, they will run them through all the different antivirus engines before they launch them out onto one or more ad networks. They usually launch them on multiple ad networks concurrently. And so over here I have a graph of a study that we did where we identified a whole bunch of malvertisements on the x-axis, and every time that we detected a malvertisement on the y-axis, we measured how many of the traditional antivirus engines detected that malvertisement at the time that we did. And what we saw is that in the best case, only 26% of the traditional antivirus engines, that the signature-based antivirus engines, detected the malvertisement. Over time, over 24 hours, over 48 hours, because their model is one in which a human malware researcher needs to look at the piece of malware, develop a signature, and then deploy it, it takes them time for the defenses to get out there. When we do our anti-malvertising scanning at Dacient, we aggressively use behavioral techniques where we identify, well, what is the malware doing as opposed to what does the code look like. So we identify things like, well, are there new processes being started on the machine? To an extent, if the malvertiser is going to do the bad thing, they are going to have to do something observable of that kind. And so this is an example, but it basically is an indication that as a world, we need to move to a model where more and more behavioral defenses are being used. And in fact, even with ad networks that have deployed internal defenses, when they say attempt to use existing antivirus engines, this is one of the reasons that a lot of things kind of get past some initial filters. But this trend of zero-day malware, I think, will just continue. The attackers are able to generate new variants of malware in a very automated way, and we need to of course counter that. So in any case, we had seen that in 44% of the cases, the malvertisements weren't detected by any traditional antivirus engine, and so this is why having a good anti-malvertising service as a complement to existing defenses is a very good way to go. So the next trend that I'll mention is that the malvertisers have been doing more and more to just look as legitimate as possible. So in fact, sometimes a malvertiser won't just create a new ad campaign on an ad network. They will start a ad network of their own, and they will register a domain. They will put up a whole website. This screenshot here is from a malvertiser that has set up an ad network of their own. You could see they make it look very legitimate. They talk about all the different benefits. If you click join today, there's a contact form. Of course, it's not as built out as a more legitimate ad network might be, but you could imagine that for anyone that might be doing a review at an ad network of a particular ad, this could look good enough. So they dress up. They also squat. Whenever they serve their malvertisements, they choose domains that are very similar to legitimate ad network domains. So for instance, just earlier this year, there were attacks where the malvertiser used domains like ServingSys, except serving has two I's. ServingSys is of course a more well-known ad network, except the attackers threw two I's in there. They were able to get that domain registered. And then while there is a legitimate ad network named AdverNation, there is no legitimate ad network named AdvertNation, but the attackers were able to use these to get past defenses of some medium-sized ad networks. The other thing that we've seen malvertisers do is that when we first started doing this, we'd see that the malvertisers, once the redirect got served to them, they would serve like the drive-by download all the time, or they would serve the fake AV all the time. But in a world where we're stepping up defenses, we're seeing that they're doing more and more to not do the bad thing, to not serve the malicious code all the time. And so then there's a lot of other things that we've had to do, with regards to doing predictive alerting and monitoring across many different ad networks. And the first time that we see something bad across any one of them, we then send alerts to all the different ad networks to get that malicious ad off being deployed. So that's another trend looking legitimate. And then the final trend that I'll talk about, I'll talk a little bit more about good news here in this particular trend, is that over the past year and a half, we've, with our telemetry, been monitoring hundreds of ad networks, and we've seen that the average lifetime of a malvertisement has been going down. We hope and expect that's because more defenses have been getting deployed. But back in Q2 of 2010, when we started assessing what was the average lifetime of a malvertising campaign, it came out at about 11.8 days. And the reason for that is because the malvertisers would launch an attack on a Friday. Over the weekend, very few people would respond to it. By the time that the next week came around, emails started getting looked at, and actions started taking place. But because of the fact that there's a lot of parties in between the user and between the offending ad network, tracing it down takes some time. And so on average, it was taking until after the end of the next weekend to take the malvertisement off the network. On the other hand, over time, over the past year, we've seen that the average lifetime of a malvertisement has come down to 2.7 days. Now, I should mention that, by the way, in our telemetry, we do include some of our customer ad networks, so this might be biased and may show a state of the world that's a little better than it really is. But, the idea here is that we're working together to bring these times down by basically putting more and more automation into place when malvertisements are found. So that's the fifth trend that I wanted to talk about in the area of malvertising. With regards to mitigating malvertising, I think it's important to take a holistic approach, just as one does with many other security problems on the internet, where the holistic approach should take prevention, detection, as well as containment and recovery into account. Over here on this slide, I've talked about a number of steps that we've been seeing more and more ad networks employ. So, for instance, on the prevention side, ad networks should vet the advertisers. They should vet ad agencies that they work with. They should make sure that their ad ops team has an appropriate level of education about malvertising threats and what malvertiser signups look like. They also can scan ads before taking them live. Of course, because of the fact that the malvertiser may initially deploy a legitimate ad, it's important to have ongoing monitoring and ongoing detection so that when the malvertiser puts up the malicious ad on Friday night or Saturday morning, that can get identified. From a detection perspective, the more we can do to have more monitoring for malvertisements at the leaves, the better. And we've also been using techniques like adaptive scanning, where, for instance, when one of our customers gives us an ad tag, we assess what is the amount of inventory behind that ad tag. We basically sample it enough so that we build up the syndication tree. We see with every incremental load of it, how many additional edges get added to the ad syndication tree, when do we have a good amount of coverage, 80, 90% across the inventory, and use that to figure out what's the appropriate monitoring frequency that should be used for any ad tag or creative in the wild. Finally, with regards to containment and recovery, one of the very first things that any ad network should do is, of course, have an incident response plan. Malvertisements will happen. It's important that when they happen, there's just a sequence of steps that have already been thought about. And of course, once the basic incident response plan is in place, putting APIs and, first of all, getting monitoring of some sort on the anti-malvertising front is important. A lot of times when we work, especially with medium-sized ad networks, they're doing things like sending ad tags over in spreadsheets. We're sending alerts back out by email. That's a great next step. But even better is when we can put an API in place to have a malvertisement taken down automatically, or kicked up for a manual review or something like that. So that's what's been done on the containment and recovery. And I've also been glad to see certain industry groups coming together to put more into guidelines around how to deal with malvertising problems. So, for instance, the Online Trust Alliance has put together a set of guidelines that ad networks of all sizes can follow in order to get malvertisements off the network. But I think it's important to take a holistic approach to this. So that's what I wanted to cover on malvertising. I wanted to also now jump into talking a little bit about what's going on in the mobile malware space and in the mobile application space, and then relate it back to malvertising. So let's see. So actually, any quick questions? Or should we save those to the end? We can save those to the end. So one of the trends that we've been tracking at Dacient is just the rise in mobile application malware. It's affected every major platform. So this past March, there were about 50 applications on the Google Android market that had gotten downloaded, had malware injected into them, repackaged and uploaded back into the market, and 250,000 or so users downloaded these infected versions of Android apps. The app, when infected, it would make a connection to a bot master. It would send out the user's device ID. It would also try to take root on the device. So it's affected the Android platform, but it's also affected every other platform as well. For instance, on the iOS platform, there was a piece of malware called iKey, and there were a number of variants of it: iKey A, iKey B. It affected mostly jailbroken iPhones, but what it did is when it infected an iPhone, it would rickroll the phone and change the user's wallpaper to a picture of Rick Astley, and then continue spreading to other devices on the network. The attack vector that it used is that the jailbroken iPhones had a default SSH password. If the user had jailbroken their iPhone but not changed that password, then the malware would use that to infect the device. One could imagine that on a more open platform, this could happen just as easily even now. We've also seen financially targeted mobile malware launch. So Zitmo is a piece of mobile malware called, this is an acronym for Zeus in the mobile. So for those of you that have been in the security world for a while, you may have heard of the Zeus botnet. It has wreaked havoc for a lot of financial institutions, mostly by stealing login credentials for bank and brokerage type websites. And so, of course, the financial institutions would deploy more and more defenses, so that even if a username and password was stolen, then two-factor authentication could then help thwart the attackers. Very often, that two-factor authentication would come via an SMS message to a user or via some application on the mobile device. Well, what Zitmo did actually on all these platforms is it would socially engineer the user on the web to enter their mobile phone number, and then once the attacker had the user's mobile phone number, it would send their phone a quote-unquote security certificate, which was really an application that would start logging all of the user's SMS traffic. And so that way, when the user went to log into their financial website, they would provide the username and password. They would have the two-factor authentication code sent to their phone. Of course, Zipmo would log that SMS and also send that up to the attacker. And so the attacker then had all the credentials necessary. So we've seen some increase in sophistication in what mobile malware does. So at Dacient, we've been using a variety of techniques to study mobile malware. Actually, I was just at Black Hat about 2 weeks ago and gave a talk on mobile malware madness, and we talked about a study that we did, just a fun weekend project of scanning 10,000 Android applications from Google's Android market with behavioral analysis. So behavioral analysis is interesting because as compared to static analysis and or signature-based approaches, which are all good approaches and I believe should all be used together, behavioral analysis has a couple advantages. So for instance, while a static analysis of a mobile application might be able to tell you that the application might try to access a user's IMEI number, or because it has a certain library linked in, might do this or might do that, it doesn't necessarily tell you about what the application actually does at runtime. And by doing a behavioral analysis, also sometimes called dynamic analysis, where you run the application, you can get answers to more detailed questions like, did it actually access the user's IMEI number? Did it, what domains and IPs did it actually access when it ran, even though it may have a whole bunch of things hard-coded into it? So it can answer questions like that. It can answer questions like how many entries in the user's address book got accessed, not just does the app have the capability to access the address book, but what did it actually do with it? So those are a bunch of pros of behavioral analysis. It helps answer some of these kinds of questions, and I'll present some results from the study that we did on the 10,000 Android applications. But it does have some cons. It's of course more expensive to run all of these applications. It takes more CPU, it takes more bandwidth. So in order to get around that, in terms of using this kind of analysis for actually fighting malware on phones, we believe that behavioral analysis should, especially heavyweight behavioral analysis, should be run on servers, quote unquote, in the cloud, as opposed to actually on the device itself. As opposed to, traditional AV packages on PCs have been doing more and more behavioral analysis, but have sometimes fell under scrutiny because they slow users' machines down. But doing behavioral analysis contributes to that, and so the more that we can farm off to the server, the better. In addition, there's all kinds of problems that you need to solve with regards to anti-reversing. You need to make sure that malware doesn't know that it's being analyzed in an emulator. On one hand, it's from a theoretical perspective, completely impossible to solve problems like that. But there are a number of good countermeasures that one can put in place, up to and including actually running applications on highly instrumented devices. So we do see a world where behavioral detections and signature-based detections can work together. We see a model where behavioral scanning of applications can be done in the cloud and be used to automatically generate signatures that can be pushed to perhaps antivirus on the devices or to network elements inside a telecom network that can help use that kind of information. So in any case, we do view behavioral approaches, signature-based analysis, and static analysis as all complementary, and I'll talk about some of the results that we found by analyzing applications with behavioral techniques. So in our study, we chose 10,000 applications, as I mentioned. We chose them from over 30 different categories, and we did simulate some user interaction with all of the applications. We could have actually done much more, but we found that even just doing very basic interactions was very often sufficient to reveal interesting behavior. So we studied privacy violations, we studied network access, we studied bandwidth utilization, we studied a whole bunch of things. I don't have the time to discuss all of those results today, but if you're interested, and I'll cover the IMEI leakage today, but there's a white paper at our website, so feel free to come download that if you're interested in all the results. So one of the more interesting results from the analysis that we did is out of the 10,000 applications, we found that about 842 of them were leaking users' personal IMEI information. So to be clear, when you download an Android application, it asks you for all kinds of permissions. Most users will just click yes, yes, yes. And so the question is, what does it do with all the capabilities that you gave that application thereafter? So we saw that just over 20% of the applications made requests to access the IMEI number on the device. We saw that a subset of those, though, actually then not only accessed the IMEI number, but sent it out over the network, either in the clear or a hashed version of it. Now, when we say that I sent it remotely, it's either sent it to the developer's remote server, or it sent it to a analytics package, or it sent it to an ad network. So sometimes it was the case that the application writer did it themselves. Sometimes they were using a third-party library that just go ahead and sent it off. So wanted to mention that. Also want to mention that even if you hash an IMEI number, it's typically not sufficient with regards to protecting privacy, because of the fact that if you look at the structure of an IMEI number, it's 15 digits. One of the digits is dedicated to a sanity check, parity check. The other 14 digits are comprised of 8 that make up a manufacturer code and 6 that make up a device ID. So the only real entropy that you have is 6 digits, which is not a lot. And so one of our researchers at Dacient, he went around the office and basically reversed the IMEI numbers of all of the iPhone users in our company pretty quickly by actually just building lookup tables with the pre-images of all the IMEI numbers for iPhones. So in any case, we thought this was a pretty interesting result that has some interesting privacy implications. And let me also put out some recommendations as to what Android developers can do about these sorts of things. So if you're an Android application developer and you find yourself being drawn to use the IMEI because you need a user ID, one of the things that I'll put forth is that the IMEI number is a very bad choice for a user ID. If the user switches phones, then you basically lose continuity with that user. So instead, you could just have your server generate a random user ID. It has the downside that you need to keep track of state of all the different numbers that you've used, but at least then you won't lose your users across the phones. In addition, you could salt the hash. Hashing IMEI number itself isn't enough, but you could salt the hash and basically throw in more entropy. And that will allow you to use the IMEI number, but in a privacy-preserving way. So in any case, I would recommend those approaches if you're using IMEI numbers for your own applications and storing these things on your servers. If you are using third-party libraries, whether they be analytics packages, whether they be ad packages, I think it's important to vet those third-party packages and understand, well, what are they doing? For instance, at Black Hat, I met up with a mobile phone application developer that actually had gotten sued because a number of the applications that they had developed for their clients was leaking private information because of what the third-party libraries were doing and not because of what their own applications were doing. So that's a few recommendations. In terms of using behavioral analysis to detect malware, that's the results that we've seen there are pretty promising. One can imagine that a good mobile malware detection system has hundreds of signals, but I'll present just 2. So in one example, we had conducted behavioral analysis of Droid Dream and found that because it used the Rage Against the Cage exploit, which starts a whole bunch of processes, because each of these processes start off at a high privilege level and they're supposed to come down. There's a corner case where if there's enough processes running on the device, it doesn't come back down to user level privilege properly. So we had seen that in our emulation infrastructure, in our highly instrumented emulation infrastructure, while there might be on average 60 or so processes running on the emulator with a standard deviation of just less than 5, when you run Droid Dream, on average 660 processes started. That's a very clear indicator that something is going wrong, and in particular the Rage Against the Cage exploit also had a number of other very observable signals. Another example of a signal is undesired SMS activity. So there's a number of mobile malware packages which would send premium SMS messages out over the network. That's what the cyber criminals were doing to monetize the applications. And so when these various fake movie players started, they would start off sending, these SMS messages with no user interaction, and that's also a pretty interesting indication. Now, of course, in order to have these things be proper signals, you have to do some refinements because you want to avoid false positives, but just wanted to give a flavor of the kinds of behavioral detection signals that one can use to identify mobile malware. Let's see, I'll also just talk about a couple examples. So here's an example of a application that we conducted a scan on, which was doing a privacy violation. It was sending out a MD5 hash of the user's IMEI number, and we can see that in this GET request, HTTP request that's made to a host in Japan, actually an ad network in Japan, it would send out the UDID and use the MD5 hash of the IMEI as the UDID. So that was definitely very observable. We, of course, saw that it had other network behavior, but that's an example of a privacy violation that we detected using some front infrastructure that we built. Here's a couple results of scans that we did of on the malware front. So in this particular case, Droid Dream set off smoking gun type of alarms because it attempted to take root access via the Rage Against the Cage exploit, both from the number of processes as well as the process of attempting to take root. It also made a direct connection to a botmaster IP, and there were a number of other domains that it accessed, AdWorld, AdMob, because what we did is scanned Bowling Time, which is a game that was one of the 50 or 60 applications that was packaged with Droid Dream. This is another example of a scan that we did. Another scan that we did is for one of the movie players that I mentioned, which of course wasn't really a movie player, but just started up and told the user, hey, the application's been installed, and then goes forward with sending out premium SMS messages. So that's another example of a mobile malware alert. I talked about malvertising in the first part of the talk, and I talked about mobile applications and mobile malware in the second part of the talk, and I think we're going to see these kinds of things more and more so come together. So just earlier this year, courtesy of Lookout, they identified a piece of mobile malware called GG Tracker. What GG Tracker did is it would, you'd have an application, there would be an ad inside that application. If you click on the ad, it would start up the web browser on the phone and take the user to a site here at this free app settings domain that attempted to look like the Android market and encourage the user to download an application. Of course, if the user downloads the application, it sent down malware. And with some of the types of attacks that I talked about earlier, I talked about malvertisements doing drive-by downloads. In this case, we have a malvertisement that didn't really do a drive-by download. It was socially engineered to get the user to click on the thing. But we were interested in this question of, could it have spread via a drive-by download on the Android platform? When we had looked around, we had seen a number of vulnerabilities in various software packages and WebKit and a number of other packages, and we wanted to ask the question of, what is between now and the cyber criminals writing drive-by downloads on Android, and the answer was not much. So. One of the things that we wanted to do was understand, could malvertisements start spreading via drive-by downloads on the Android platform? At the same time, we didn't want to do a set of work or publish a set of work which would advance the cyber criminals. Although, given that we're thinking about this, we're pretty sure that the cyber criminals are thinking about this and or are, maybe even running ahead of us. But basically, we prototyped a drive-by attack on Android that actually did a drive-by upload in the sense that we had a three-step attack where the user visited a compromised web page. On that compromised web page, we put a set of JavaScript which tickled a WebKit vulnerability and took advantage of some deficiencies in how WebKit was processing floating point numbers to basically get backdoor access to the phone, and then we sent down some code which took advantage of a vulnerability in the Android version, in the Skype version for Android, in which Skype would log users' IM conversations and store them in a database, and it didn't encrypt them, and it also did not it didn't encrypt them, and it also made the files world readable, which means that while Android has a nice structure in place where each application has its own user ID, and that's supposed to help compartmentalize things, with this particular vulnerability, the second that you write the file out as world readable, you lose all those benefits. So in this case, we had the user do a drive-by upload. So I can actually demo what we had done here. And I should mention that we used all existing vulnerabilities. We didn't come up with any 0 days. So this is kind of all out there. And we didn't advance what the attackers can do, but simply show that it is possible. So in this demo, we have on the right-hand side, we have the emulator. We're going to go to a website called infectedsite.com, which we put some code at, which exploits the WebKit vuln and then gives the backdoor access. On the top left, you'll see the web server log, which serves our exploit page. On the bottom left, you'll see basically the attacker's window. So this is more of a targeted attack. We didn't package this up into an exploit kit. We didn't release that exploit kit out on the internet or anything like that. But it should give you an example of what's possible. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and click. We're going to, and if QuickTime and whatnot gets along with me, then we'll see that we'll go to infectedsite.com. We'll start a web page. It'll just be a blank web page, but what will happen is that in the attacker's window, it will give the attacker the ability to connect in and upload the main.db database that Skype used to store the user's IM conversations, and then the attacker can upload that to their own server and basically run a SQL query which gets the IM conversation. In this particular case, the IM conversation is, this is a secret message because Skype uses the encryption. So forgive the grammar, but the idea is that the attacker was able to access the user's IM Skype conversations, just by having lured the user to a infected web page. So that's this drive-by attack. Of course, I should mention that the attacker could also upload Rage Against the Cage, exploit, a whole number of root exploits, and then take root on the device as well. So complete ownership of the device is possible. Now, with regards to mobile malvertising, one could imagine that there could be a mobile ad which basically loads a URL like infectedsite.com and actually does the same thing just by loading an ad on within an application. So I think the time to start preparing for mobile malvertisements is now. We know that cybercriminals follow the money. We know that mobile devices are getting used more and more so for mobile banking, mobile payments. I think it's important to take a zero tolerance policy towards this and start putting countermeasures in place. So what folks can do right now is vet their syndication partners proactively, but I think we need to put more and more automated defenses in to fight mobile malvertising, just as we do so for existing malvertising. So in any case, I wanted to give a shout out to a number of team members at Dacient who helped make this work possible, and just wanted to summarize by saying that there's a lot that we've learned from malvertising on the web. There's a lot that we've learned from how malware has been used in PC-based platforms. I think that there's a lot that can be done to fight looming threats. And I'd like to, I look forward to using this opportunity and afterwards to be a part of a continued discussion with regards to how we can, as a Google Ventures portfolio company, kind of returning to the mothership to give this tech talk, talk about how we can work together to address these kinds of issues. I think there's a lot of great things that have been done to provide more and more security over the internet and the mobile internet, and I look forward to helping continue to make that happen. I would also just point out a couple of other resources. If you're more interested in learning more about security, you can get a copy of my book. Come to dacient.com or my personal website. I'm glad that book was helpful here at Google. In addition, at Stanford, there's a lot of courses that we have on security in general, but and actually, we're going to be introducing a course at Stanford around mobile security because a lot of enterprises and organizations are concerned about these sorts of things. But other than that, I'd just like to sum up in saying I look forward to continuing to fight the cyber criminals together. Thanks for your time. And I'm happy to take a question or two. In the back?
Could you just comment on the amount of operational effort involved in both your advertising and I guess your malware? I noticed for like malware, for example, you talked about how static analysis has got a lot of false positives, but you didn't say for behavior you get a lot of false negatives. I'm kind of wondering.
So actually, actually, to answer your questions so with regards to false positive and false negative rates, what we've found from behavioral analysis is that it allows us to achieve a much lower false negative rate as well as a much lower false positive rate, than other approaches, because of the fact that you actually see the bad thing happen, so the false positives are lower. Our false positive rate, for instance, for web malvertising is less than 1 in 10 million, and on the false negative case, we have, I mentioned our telemetry systems. We basically identify, the actual bad behavior when it happens. But the key thing is to then have a good understanding of what are all the classes of bad behavior and make sure to have them modeled and built into our system. And that's why our telemetry systems are used to monitor large parts of the internet so that we can see the scope of malicious activity that might be occurring. So that I'll address that. And then with regards to operational, deploying this kind of stuff has been made much more operationally minimal over time. So the overhead is pretty minimal. For us to get started with an ad network, we have a lot of protocols in place. It's a matter of getting access to some ad tags and an alert email address. So it's pretty straightforward. I'll take maybe one more question. Okay, so the question is, how did we simulate user interactions in these 10K applications? For this particular study that we did, we took a pretty simple approach where we threw a few random actions at the application. But one of the other things that's really nice about Android applications is that the applications in the bytecode, they declare what user events they handle. So we also have infrastructure that will generate events as per what the application expects. So that's a second class, and then we do have other classes of simulated user behavior. For instance, when there is a username or password field that very often needs to get filled in. So that's another type of class of activity that we can pursue. But basically for this study, we just did something really simple. Of course, in our infrastructure, we can do much more complicated things. Great. Thanks once again for your time today, and I look forward to following up and continuing the dialogue.